Okay, so one of the first questions here. President Wilson broke diplomatic relations with Germany when Germany announced that it would wage unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic. So that's one of the first questions. And that was, we found out about that through the Zimmerman Note. The Zimmerman Note was an agreement between, or a proposed agreement, a proposed alliance between Germany and Mexico. The Zimmerman Note involved a proposed secret agreement between Germany and Mexico. President Woodrow Wilson persuaded the American people to enter World War I. So, President Wilson persuaded the American people to enter World War I by pledging to make this war a war to end all wars and to make the world safe for democracy. President Wilson viewed America's entry into World War I as an opportunity for the United States to shape a new international order based on the ideals of democracy. Go down to the bottom of your sheet, and there's 4 names here. We have Creel, George Creel. George Creel was in charge of the Committee of Public Information and the war posters and propaganda. Herbert Hoover was in charge of the National Food Administration, helping to feed the soldiers and feed the rest of Europe during World War I. Bernard Barak was in charge of the WIB, the War Industries Board. And William Howard Taft, former President of the United States, was in charge of the Labor Board. So these 4 people you'll have to match up with what they were responsible for. Creel, Committee of Public Information. Herbert Hoover, Food Organizer. Bernard Barak, War Industries Board. William Howard Taft, the Labor Board. When the United States entered World War I, it was poorly prepared to leap into a global war. We were very unprepared for this. It took us a while. During World War I, civil liberties in America were denied to many, especially those that were suspected of disloyalty. Civil liberties were denied radicals and also German Americans. 2 constitutional amendments adopted in part because of wartime influences were the 18th Amendment, which dealt with prohibition, and the 19th Amendment, which dealt with women's suffrage movement. As a result of their work supporting the war effort, women finally received this right to vote. The 2 groups who suffered most from violence of civil liberties during World War I were German Americans and social radicals. The movement of tens of thousands of Southern blacks north during World War I resulted in a great migration, and radical violence, racial violence, occurred. Riots in the streets in the north. Most wartime mobilization agencies relied on voluntary compliance to prepare the economy for war. Voluntary compliance. Most of the money raised to finance World War I came from loans from the American people, so U.S. savings bonds, Liberty bonds, war bonds. The United States invested in itself, the public, the private people of America. When the United States entered the war, most Americans did not believe that it would be necessary to send a large amount of soldiers to Europe. They were wrong. 2 major battles of World War I in which the United States forces were engaged in were the Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. They're written up here on the board. These are the 2 battles that the American forces were heavily engaged in. With the withdrawal of the Russian forces in World War I in 1918, this resulted in a release of thousands of German troops from the Eastern Front to join the Western Front in France. So Germans no longer had to fight a war on 2 fronts. The supreme military commander of the American forces was John Pershing, Blackjack Pershing. The Second Battle of the Marne Second Battle of the Marne in World War I was significant because this allowed, or this was the beginning of the German withdrawal, and it was never reversed. So it was the beginning of the end for the Germans, the Second Marne. Now Wilson, when we ended the war, Wilson had a condition. He said that first of all, Germany must get rid of the Kaiser. The German Kaiser must be forced from power. He also then, ultimately, his goal at the Paris Peace Conference was to establish a League of Nations. The United States' main contributions to the Allied victory in World War I were supplies. Our main contribution in World War I was not battle victories, it was supplies. Financial credit, munition, oil, food. The Germans were heavily demoralized when the United States joined the war in what seemed to be unlimited amounts of troops. Woodrow Wilson had opposition to his League of Nations in the United States Senate. These were led by the Senate Republicans, and also they received kind of a label calling themselves the Irreconcilables. The most reliable support for Wilson's League of Nations came from the Democrats. The Senate likely would have accepted America's participation in the League of Nations if Wilson had been willing to compromise with League opponents in Congress, but Wilson was unwilling to compromise. So some people say the person that was at fault the most for the failure of Wilson's League of Nations was Wilson. Republican isolationists turned then to Warren Harding's presidential campaign of 1920, and that then led to ultimately a death sentence to the League of Nations. That is pretty much the ultimate weakness of the League of Nations, was that it did not include the United States. So that's about 30 multiple choice questions. I will ask you to also describe and state the significance of the following. So you write a sentence or two, short answer, describing the Zimmerman note and why was it important. Describe the